Hello! In this video, we're going to discuss some more of the objections to Bayesianism. As I see it, all objections to Bayesianism fall into one of two categories. In the first category, we have the problem of the priors. The objection here, put simply, is, hey, even if I follow Bayesianism perfectly, I still need something extra. Namely, something to give me prior probabilities. In the last video, I explained that I think the prior probabilities can come from intuitions. In the other category, you have the rest of the objections to Bayesianism, dozens of them. The objections in this category say, hey, real humans can't actually follow Bayesianism. Bayesianism is designed, so to speak, for people who are very different from us. Why? Well, the idea is that in probability theory, we built in a lot of idealizations. And when we transfer these idealizations to a theory of rationality, Bayesianism, it creates very unrealistic expectations. For example, in probability theory, the probability of every mathematical truth is 1. This gives Bayesianism the weird quirk that it assumes that everyone already knows all mathematical truths. Or, here's another example. In probability theory, there's no concept of forgetting a probability. Something just has the probability that it does, and that's that. So, when we translate probability theory to Bayesianism, it assumes that everyone's memory always functions perfectly. So, Bayesianism secretly assumes that humans are way smarter than they actually are in all sorts of ways. It assumes we are ideal agents. Not ideal in every way, but in many ways. Now, this is a problem, but it by no means makes Bayesianism useless. In a way, it's a good thing. If Bayesianism can tell us what someone who is really smart would do in our shoes, then that tells us what the smartest decision is. Then we can make those smart decisions. Yay! However, the problem is that we might find ourselves in a situation that those hypothetical ideal agents couldn't possibly be in, and then Bayesianism doesn't give us any advice. I'll contrast two different scenarios to illustrate. First, imagine that a fair dice is rolled, and then we later learn that the outcome is an even number. What would an ideal agent do in this scenario? Well, they would have assigned a prior probability of 1/6 to each possible outcome, and then, after learning that it was even, they would scribble stretch on that information, and the final probabilities of getting a 2, 4, or 6 would each be 1/3. Okay, so what should we do in that scenario? Well, despite being far less knowledgeable about math and logic, we could still do all that stuff too. So we start with credences of 1/6 for all outcomes as well, and then change to credences of 1/3 for all the even outcomes as well. Easy. We can totally apply Bayesianism in everyday circumstances like this. Now, here's another scenario. Somebody recently calculated the 100 trillionth digit of pi. Before telling anyone what it was, they first announced that it's even. What would an ideal agent do in this scenario? Well, before the calculation was ran, this agent would already know the 100 trillionth digit of pi, indeed, every digit of pi with certainty, so they would just have a credence of 1 in whatever the right answer was. Then, when they get told that it was an even number, they would just, well, stay certain of their answer because they already knew that. Okay, so what should we do in this scenario? Well, obviously, looking to an ideal agent here tells us nothing. So Bayesianism doesn't even apply to this scenario. So, now that we know that Bayesianism doesn't apply in many situations, what should we do in response? A terrible answer is to just throw out Bayesianism altogether. Bayesianism can still work in a ton of contexts, and we know that when it does work, Bayesianism gives us perfect advice about how to update our credences. Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think a better answer is to develop better rules for Bayesianism. We built Bayesianism by blindly copy-pasting the rules from probability theory and applying them to our credences. In reality, we should change the rules of Bayesianism so that it can take into account the messiness of real life. So, what changes, in particular, should we make? Good question. Philosophers and mathematicians are working on that as we speak. However, it looks like it'll take a couple decades of debating before they sort that out. So, What should we do in the meantime? Good question. For the purposes of this series, instead of giving a grand theory of how to completely remodel Bayesianism, I'm just going to analyze scenarios where Bayesianism fails on a case-by-case basis, and offer an account of how we should react in those particular scenarios. I'll pinpoint why the idealization of Bayesianism is causing a problem, and then, based on that, offer a solution to that problem in that context. As an example, take that previous scenario about the 100 trillionth digit of pi. Here's my account about how we should react to this scenario. Ahem. Calculating the 100 trillionth digit of pi is so hard for human brains that it's essentially impossible to do unaided. From our vantage point, it might as well be the result of a random 10-sided dice. And since each digit looks like it appears equally often, that would be a fair 10-sided dice. But Bayesianism fails to recognize this fact about human brains due to its idealization. That rascal of an epistemology just assumes that we can see the answer. So it just gives us zero advice on what to do with our credences. But since it's the same thing as a fair 10-sided dice, as far as we can tell, let's just treat it like that. Every outcome would have a prior probability of 1 over 10, and when we learn that the digit is even, each even digit gets boosted to a probability of 1 over 5. Piece of cake. Now, hopefully, you agree with me that this is how our credences should be updated in this context. So, if I'm presenting an argument in the future where Bayesianism breaks down and stops working due to an idealization problem, I'm going to try to, likewise, subsequently offer an account of how we should update our credences in that context. If you don't agree with my account of how to do this, of course, then that means that that particular argument won't work. So I'm going to avoid this sort of thing when I can. Which shouldn't actually be too hard. It's only in weird contexts that Bayesianism does fail like this, but then again, arguments for theism do go into a lot of weird terrain, so we'll see. Anyways, the main point I want to make is that this second category of objections doesn't render Bayesianism useless. Rather, it just presents obstacles to certain arguments in certain contexts, and these obstacles can be overcome. Now, before going, I'd like to take a look at the first category of objections again. There's a problem with using intuitions as prior probabilities that I'd like to discuss. This is what I will call the problem of inconsistent intuitions. You see, quite often, a proposition, when presented in one way, may seem intuitively true, but when presented in another way, seems intuitively false. The way humans work is that we conceptualize propositions in various ways, and our intuitions respond to the conceptualizations of the propositions rather than the propositions themselves. So, if intuitions serve as prior probabilities for propositions, what should we do to resolve the conflict between intuitions about the same proposition that's been conceptualized in multiple different ways? Well, I think there's a very straightforward answer. If we accept that intuitions are the sorts of things that we can allow influence the probability of propositions, we can combine intuitions using the process which we would use to update on uncertain evidence, the process of Jeffrey conditionalization. Just like in part 1 of this series, I'm going to give a visualization of how Jeffrey conditionalization works rather than a bunch of equations. So here we go. Say we think that the probability of the proposition that we will observe X is 1/3. Then we observe X. Or at least we think we observe X. Really, there's only a probability of 9 over 10, or 0.9, that we actually observed X rather than being mistaken. What do? Well, instead of scribbling out everywhere where X is unobserved, we only scribble out 9/10 of this section of the square. We're not done yet, though. If there's a 9/10 chance that we observed X, that means there's a 1 in 10 chance that we did not observe X. So we scribble out 1/10 of the section where X is observed. Now we're done scribbling, so we could stretch back to a square. The probability that we observed X would have gone up to 1 if we were sure we observed it, but it instead went up to 9/11, about 0.82, because of our uncertainty. Coolio. So, when we have conflicting intuitions, we could use Jeffrey conditionalization to combine them. We can treat one intuition as actually establishing the prior probability of a proposition, and the other as uncertain evidence. It doesn't matter which intuition plays which role, you get the same answer. Anyways, sorry that this video was more technical. I know it's somewhat dry, but it's important to have a functioning epistemology in the background while I go about trying to make this cumulative case. Fortunately, now that we've got all of these finer points about Bayesianism out of the way, we can actually start talking about theism in the next video. Yay! See you there!